My story tonight's going to start with Kashmir. When you think of Kashmir, or when you hear Kashmir, what do you guys think of? What comes to mind first? Sweater? A good Led Zeppelin song? Yeah, for most people. Yeah, Biryani. For me, Kashmir was actually the source and remains the source and motivation for my work and my changemaker journey. Kashmir is a place in between India and Pakistan. It's where my family is from. And my changemaker journey particularly started in the early 90s at the height of the conflict when my aunt Aisha was murdered because of the violence there. And I went back to connect with her son, my cousin and best friend at the time. And it was a particular moment that I witnessed that has motivated my work ever since. And it was actually a moment where he arrested the narrative of his life to the failures of the world around him. Instead of seeing his life as a series of choices, he was living his life as a consequence because of what was taken from him. And it was a particular moment. He was standing, greeting people as they were tapping him on the head and hugging him and kissing him, consoling him. And it was an instant where I saw his body change. He was looking out at the military bunker across the street at the time, periodically looking back at the tent filled with women crying, reading Quran. And he would turn back, and all of a sudden I saw his hands ball up into a fist. I saw his breathing. He wasn't in control of his own breath. His body tightened up and his eyes were red. This physical event that happened to him changed the narrative of how he saw himself and what his options were in life. He was physically, literally in a place of helplessness, loss, and humiliation. And the story that he told himself ever since that moment impacted how he treated himself and how he walked on this earth. How he communicated with himself internally influenced his behavior in the outside world. And that was contagious to me because when you see someone you love go through something like that, you take that on. And I ended up having an us versus them, black and white mentality, in terms of how life works. And I actually hated anyone that had anything to do with the Indian military because they took my aunt away and they hurt someone I loved. Until years later, after a wonderful night and an evening seeing a sunset at Dull Lake, driving in a car, a bomb went off. Someone had blown themselves up. And there was a sudden pinging going on around our car, bullets hitting the steel. And in that moment, my hands curled up into a fist. I lost control of my breath. I felt I was going to be a consequence of a bullet hitting my skull. And somehow my mother calmly and coolly pulled out a Quran and just started praying. She didn't even sweat. But what happened after that is what changed my us versus them mentality, what changed my view about a world being black and white instead of a world of colors. And it was getting out of that situation and driving, and all of a sudden a spotlight came on our car from the military camp because all the lights were shut off after the attack. And in that spotlight, in that moment, I made eye contact for the first time in my life with an Indian soldier. And it was the first time in my life where I communicated with him. And we didn't say a word. We were communicating with each other without saying a word. And in that moment, it shattered that binary worldview that I had, that single narrative worldview that I had, because we both were saying the same thing to each other. I don't want to be here. I don't want to be here. And that made me question things about how the narratives I was being fed were shaping my behavior and worldview. And that got even further compounded after 9/11, being a Muslim in America, and my American friends asking me, why are you guys trying to kill us? And then going to Kashmir and my Muslim friends saying, why are you guys trying to kill us? And I was in this weird place of trying to communicate one side to the other. So for me, communications and storytelling, it is not transactional. It is not a blog post. It is not a Snapchat. It is not a post on Instagram. It is a process of healing and empowerment. In my work, 8 years working with young people all over the world, I'm seeing a trend that's troubling, which is young people accepting a single narrative of their lives, of who they are. One that is led by fear instead of curiosity. fear instead of curiosity. Sounds familiar at this country at this moment, doesn't it? The reason this is problematic, well, science shows this a lot actually, particularly when we work with communities that have been impacted by trauma and chronic stress and fear and anxiety. Having your narrative led by fear instead of curiosity translates to isolation, translates to an inability to form pro-social relationships, an inability to have decision-making skills and set goals. Neuroscience and psychology are showing us the impacts of this type of impact on people that are going through stress and trauma, right? A single narrative has all these impacts. And in a world where the only constant is change, are we equipping young people to understand how their mind and body respond to change? Our world is on fire right now. So we must support young people in understanding their own resilience assets and being better able to cope with the only constant in this world and in this life at this moment in our history as human beings, which is change. And that's where MeWe comes in. All right, so our hypothesis in MeWe, which is something I founded years ago, is an arrested narrative of oneself translates to an arrested development of oneself. What does an arrested development look like? It looks like communities of young people being unable to form goals. Communities of young people that when you ask them a question, they put their eyes down and they start to cry. Right? The world ain't going to get better if we're not reframing that for them. How can we flip the narrative and help them reclaim control of the narrative of themselves and of their lives? Stories for me are formulas for change. Stories are formulas for change. Stories are not linear. It's where shifts happen, good or bad. And if stories are formulas for change, that means stories aren't static. And guess what? Human beings are not static. Our brains are not static. There's a TED talk about how we're not stuck with the brains that we're born with. Human beings are also formulas of change. Human beings are living, breathing stories where our words impact our chemistry and how we treat ourselves and the world around us. So with MeWe, we have a methodology where we use communications as a tool to promote mental health, psychosocial support, and empowerment of marginalized youth communities all over the world. What we're most known for is something called #MeWeSyria, where I'm equipping young Syrians to experience the program. These are teachers, these are youth activists, and they self-replicate and entrepreneur their own MeWe hubs. And they're doing it right now in 8 cities across 3 countries on their own because they believe in it. With the methodology, we have a particular way we do things, which is very kind of weird to explain. But we frame communications in 3 ways: internal communication, interpersonal communication, and then public. But we start with the internal. And this is where the communications and healing components come in together, specifically in 3 ways: interoception, goal setting, and building relationships. Okay, well, what is interoception? It's awareness of your body, your physical body, your senses of your body. The psychologist Dr. Van der Kolk says, knowing what we feel is the first step to knowing why we feel, right? So we have an exercise in our program where we do something called body mapping, where we read certain words, and the young refugees map out where they're feeling these words on their bodies. In another exercise, we have them understand the story construct of a hero's journey, and they then do a hero's journey of their own brains, creating dialogue between the automatic and the slower systems of the brain. What are the different dialogues happening within one's brain? So you see, through communications, we're making accessible self-awareness, trying to resync the mind with the heart and the breath, which is what storytelling is. Another communications component related to healing is goal setting, extremely important, right? He who has a why can bear almost any how, Nietzsche said, right? Purpose, having a destination can pull you from where you're trapped in, right? And Viktor Frankl really promoted this work. He's a psychotherapist that survived a concentration camp, right? And he noticed that the people that died quickest were the ones that couldn't formulate or think of a goal or a purpose. So in MeWe, we have several exercises, and one of them is called Future to Present, where they're creating a narrative from their future self to their present self. It's between themselves in 2028 talking to themselves in 2018. It's a powerful exercise. And the way that we do it, it's internal, interpersonal, public. They start with mindfulness, reflection, right? Breathing, body awareness. And then they write and record, creative writing, imaginative thinking. And then they do peer-to-peer sharing, so that interpersonal communications component. And then they share it publicly. And one of the ways they share it publicly is through video blogging, which is the images you see above me. And this is one of my favorite parts of the program. Because if you look at the top right at Hoda in Turkey, this is similar for a lot of girls and women that are going through this exercise. This is the first time they're looking at themselves on a camera. Now, a lot of us in this room have pushed a button before, hit a record button, right? There's plenty of cameramen here doing the same thing right now. But for a lot of the people that we work with before, they never had an opportunity to push a button. There's a moment of hesitancy where all these things, all the narratives in their body that are telling them, no, don't push that button. It ain't worth it. You can't do it. They stop themselves. There's this hesitancy that always happens. And then there's this sync that happens where when they push that button, they're detonating all the limitations that have kept them from syncing their mind and their heart with their breath. And Huda beautifully captured this moment, and she turned around to me with a smile, and she said, this is the first time I've had a conversation with myself. Imagine, she's 50 plus years old. This is the first time she's having a conversation with herself. Now, what's happening through this methodology? Well, the data still needs to be verified, and we have to improve our measuring because, as I just mentioned, even the act of doing a pre and post assessment with our young people can trigger them. The act of asking a question can be seen as an investigation, not as something that's trying to help them. But we're noticing some patterns that are really important that speak to the power of storytelling as a tool for healing and empowerment. One is we're noticing that through pre and post self-assessments that young people are reporting higher capacities for empathy. They're reporting greater awareness of stresses as they're coming on and their coping mechanisms to overcome them. And another interesting point is they're reporting an enhanced capacity for collaborating with others, which goes into this pro-social element of healing. As Dr. Van der Kolk also says, healing cannot happen in isolation. Your body and mind try and trick you into thinking that you need to be isolated, but actually the cure is not isolation, it's relationships, right? So through MeWe, what we have now, and we're doing this in Honduras, by the way, and we're seeing similar results. Recently we piloted in Honduras. But through MeWe, what we have now is over the last 2 years, we've trained 50 Syrian refugees who have experienced the program, have entrepreneured it, and have been localizing it and spreading it to refugees in their own communities. And they've reached more than 1,400 on their own. And each hub is a safe space where relationships are being formed and young people are literally and physically reauthoring their future. That's change, right? That's the power of storytelling. 3 takeaways that I just want to leave with you. But before I get to that, I just need to explain this picture because it's very powerful, okay? This is a bracelet made by Nadia, who's a Syrian refugee. Nadia was in Turkey going through the program. She didn't say a word to me the whole training, not a word, until the last day. She pulled me aside. She told me to close my eyes and open my hand. And she took off this bracelet that she made with her own hands and dropped it in my hand. And I said, what is this? She said, I made this when the war started, when I was home. And I've carried it with me ever since I witnessed the traumas, ever since I had to leave my home and everything I knew. I've carried it with me for 5 years. And she said, now I can give it to you. I can let go of it. That is change. That's social and emotional learning and development that young people need to thrive in a world in constant disruption and change. All right, 3 takeaways. Words are events. They change things, they do things. One of my favorite writers, Ursula Le Guin, said that. Second thing, communications and storytelling is not transactional. I'm a storyteller, and it's a word that gets butchered to death everywhere, and I hate it. Storytelling is the transference of energy to shift mindsets. It's the transference of energy to shift mindsets. That's what storytelling is. And that's why storytelling can be used as a tool for healing and empowerment. And the last thing I'll say that I would leave with you about storytelling is that the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves shapes how we treat ourselves. And how we treat ourselves influences how we walk on this earth and the choices we make every day. So when you guys are brushing your teeth tomorrow morning, looking in the mirror, I want you to ask yourself, where do I feel the stories in me? And am I in control of them? Thank you.